All right, everyone. It's part two of the John Fahey, The Life and Times of John Fahey with Steve Lowenthal, Biographer, and Sean Cole's Train. So it's part two. We examine the 70s, 80s, 90s through his death. We talk about his influence. We talk about all kinds of things related to Fahey, some Robbie Basho topics. Just a reminder to check out the VDSQ label, which Steve curates and runs. And also Sean Cole's Train and his band Birth Defects have announced their pre-order for their record. And yeah, check out those links on the bottom. And this has been real fun. Hope to do more things like this in the future. So anyway, enjoy the second part of my interview with Steve Lowenthal.
As our guest tonight in Rock Palace, would you now please welcome the master of American primitive guitar, Mr. John Fahey.
Thank you. And here we all are tonight. In Deutschland.
That's for the guitar, okay?
Yeah. Excuse me.
Dom here with Sean Cole's Train, fellow Fahey superfan, and Steve once again for part two for the author of Dance of Death, the John Fahey story, published 2014, I think it is, still available out there again for all you folks. And so, this was initially going to be a discussion, but we started getting in so deep as you saw that we just felt warranted part two, and it seemed like a good place to start was like the dawn of the 70s. And I guess I'll say in many ways, maybe it's sort of the most busy, maybe not the most busy, but it seems like he's touring the most maybe at this point in his career, Fahey.
The 70s found Fahey career-wise in somewhat of a stable place. He had real management. He was recording for major record labels. There was a touring circuit that existed that really catered to what he was doing both in the US and in Europe. The infrastructure was really there for him to succeed and for him to take his music to the next level. And I think performance-wise and just playing-wise, myself and I think a lot of other people would consider an album like Fare Forward Voyagers to be amongst his greatest performances in terms of virtuosity in regards to him playing his instrument. We talk a little bit about Fahey not being necessarily the most technical or flashy guitar player,
Right.
of the 20th century. But listening to an album like Fare Forward Voyager sort of makes an argument against that, because it is so it's a beautiful record. The performances are stunning, and it's really like a note for note perfect record and listen. He sort of reached the apex of his playing and his career in the 70s.
This album, just to stop you real quick, isn't this the one in your book I know you talk about there? He got into meditation and yoga essentially, right? Because
Yes.
isn't the story that he wanted to impress a woman or something like that?
Yes, very much so. As of many Fahey albums, is sort of centered around the presence of a romantic interest in his life. At the time, he was a follower of Swami Satchidananda, who is a very popular guru out here in California. Other disciples of the same Swami during this time were Alice Coltrane,
Yeah.
uh, Carlos
You can see,
Santana.
oops. Yeah, you can
Um,
see it on the bottom there, but yeah.
yeah, yeah. So, and I think that the Swami and the yoga center where he operated out of, they were actually like courting musicians to
Right.
join their practice, and John met this. I believe it was the Swami's secretary or the established the communities one of their young coordinators. Yeah, this woman, and he started up. He had quite the infatuation with her and courted her very strongly. He would send her like rooms full of flowers and all of these things, and just like really love bombing. This
Is
young.
that a hint for like what's to come in the 90s? Because there is, we know the second to last record, there's a little bit of that comes into play.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
John created these like great fantasies around these women that he met, and just sort of like created this universe in his imagination of what their lives might potentially be like, and then this term didn't even exist when I was writing the book, but yeah, he was quite the love bomber and was very overwhelming in his romantic pursuits at the time. So the Swami and their people sort of encouraged her to be with John, and they started a relationship. And while they were in California on the retreat and doing yoga every day, things were really great. And then they got married very quickly after a couple months, so sort of like a whirlwind marriage. And then she went out on tour with John, and that's when everything spiraled out of
She
control.
saw the real John there, I guess.
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah.
John, as we sort of stated earlier, he had terrible stage fright, which he would use alcohol to combat, and he'd get to the point where he'd be toxically blacking out on stage at times, and lashing out at his audience, and lashing out at his helpers and the people around him, and his
And I would, Steve, I'm not trying to minimize any of that because obviously that is, that's obviously due to, you know, a lot of issues that he was dealing with. But we had talked about in part one a little bit about this mystique with Fahey. Does that lend a little bit of that stuff? Did he also lean into it a little bit, or was he at this point just kind of really not in a good place, or was it a little bit of both?
It was definitely a little bit of both. From my understanding, he sort of leaned into the impressions that other people cast on him. And he wasn't naturally that social in a way. So, and again, like, if we're looking at like the sort of rock and folk worlds of the 60s and 70s, that we think a lot of like hedonism, we think a lot of excess, we think of a lot of like kind of rock star like kind of, antics and whatnot. And other than his self-medication, John wasn't interested in any of that kind of stuff. He wasn't really rebelling against, he wasn't really part of the counterculture. He wasn't part of the free love movement or anything like that. He was anti psychedelics, at a time when that was certainly in vogue, or rather doing psychedelics was in vogue, and he was very out of step with that movement. So yeah, he was somewhat of an iconoclast, and the things that people really looked up to Fahey were his accomplishments. His thesis on Charlie Patton was a remarkable achievement, and it was one of the first serious academic studies of country blues. He started his own record label, obviously, in the 60s. So by the 70s, he was sort of like a veteran of independent music at a time where it was still, in its nascency. And, he was an authority. He was a man of many accomplishments that people could look up to. So when people were looking, there was a lot of, certainly there were a lot of people who were around the music scene at the time, maybe aspiring musicians or people involved in the community or counterculture and whatnot that were sort of looking for a direction or looking for a path. John was certainly one of these people, which is how he got involved with, the Swami Satchidanai in the first place. So yeah, a lot of people would come to John looking for answers, because from a certain distance it looked as though he had everything figured out. And then again, sort of what we're saying is once he sort of broke through sort of those illusions and got to know the real John, he actually had very little figured out and didn't really possess much in the way of answers for other people.
But he had amassed at this point like a decent career, and he was publishing was decent. He was living off his music, by this point, pretty comfortably. It seems like. I also wanted to mention the America LP, which came out, I believe, just before, which
Yeah, I
is
think America was 71 and Fair Forward was 73, if I recall correctly.
a fair forward is a absolute highlight in his career, and I would say that this one is as well.
John considered America his finest record. And I think listeners could understand why. Again, their performances were just, absolutely incredible. And it's sort of, each of the Fahey records leading up to America was sort of, different versions of what would sort of become sort of, America being like the master stroke that it is.
Did he, when he was sort of working on that record and kind of putting it together, was that the intention to kind of sort of make, we could argue, and I would say that, yeah, I would agree that that's kind of his almost statement record in a way, but did he mold it that way? Was that the intention?
Yeah, I don't think so. Again, I'm just sort of, not directly from John on that particular topic, but it seemed to me that John was always sort of working closer and closer to this grand vision of what he had for his music. And which is sort of interesting why he went back and re-recorded his early records because he was trying to get closer and closer to that vision. And I think, I just think it just happened because of the success of his career to that point. He was playing so often, he was touring, and even though he hated it and, made him miserable. He never played better in his life, than the early '70s, into 1980 about. And that was really, his playing is just so stellar. He really became a master of his instrument in that time period. And I think it just sort of like that just sort of coincided with America rather than say he did something specific to make it different than prior records. I just think that's just sort of how his prowess developed, and it really just like came into full circle with America, which is a really interesting record and has a lot of themes to it and whatnot that resonate very strongly today, of environmentalism, of sort of transcendentalism, and
Mhm.
sort of, I don't know, almost like a Walt Whitman sort of take on Americana.
Well, interestingly, it has the voice of the turtle track on it. Maybe talk a little bit. I mean, we haven't discussed this, and it's obviously a big part of his imagery and his mascot, so to speak, the turtle. What's the significance for the turtle in
And real
Fahey's
quick,
life?
before you even start that, Steve, I'm a
Yeah,
University of Maryland guy, so
Yes.
the Terrapin is us. I mean,
right.
that's all I wanted to say about that. But go right
There
ahead.
you go. I mean, I think Sean, that's a
Turtle.
very it's a very prescient point to make. John grew up in Tacoma Park, Maryland. He grew up around the rivers and creeks of Maryland, and the turtles were his favorite animal. And sort of throughout his career, being on the road a lot and driving around the highways, if he ever saw a turtle crossing the highway, he would stop the car, get out, pick up the turtle, and bring it to the other side of the highway so it got to where it wanted to be safely. He would, you know, take dozens of turtles and home them in his bathroom in his bathtub until it got filthy. He was just obsessed with turtles. They were his favorite animal. He considered them sacred, and really went out of his way to anytime he could to help a turtle.
Right. And, you know, it's you find them as early, obviously you find them around as early recordings into the 70s. I mean, and just the artwork on this America is just stunning. This
And
is
I mean, I would even
the
say
high point
too,
of of
I,
his
I was
art.
gonna say, not to interrupt you, but
Yeah.
I just, this is just a thought that came to my mind. If And I'm sure, Steve, you've been to Tacoma probably just doing research, I assume. So,
Yes.
like, granted, we didn't see Tacoma in the 50s and the 60s, but Tacoma was and still is, because actually, Dom, where you're going to be playing in June, that is pretty much right in Tacoma. Rhizome is right there, pretty much in Tacoma. It's kind of
Yeah.
on the DC side of Tacoma, but you just walk a couple blocks and you're kind of in the thick of where Fahey kind of cut his teeth. But what I was sort of getting at was, even the little bit of traversing I've done in Tacoma, it is like sort of the documentary. It's very nature-esque. There's a lot of water. There's still a lot of trees. It still feels very much like you could kind of go almost anywhere and end up in the woods. So there's some sort of, like, going back to sort of Dom, what you were saying, there's that sort of art of like turtles and like maybe not the forest, but very nature-esque is very Tacoma even today.
Right.
Very much so. So sort of, moving forward a little bit, one could sort of say, the 70s was sort of the peak of John's career, both technically as a musician and commercially as an artist. He found a lot of success with Leo Kottke, who was a young
Right.
guitar player who came under his wing. He suggested Kottke record an instrumental record for Tacoma, and it ended up being, the best-selling instrumental guitar record of all time.
Yeah.
So, it was quite a windfall for the label, for Tacoma, for an independent label to have a record that's successful. And around the same time, John recorded his Christmas records, which were his most successful records commercially, and really introduced him to a whole new audience and really connected his love of theology with his love of music in a way where, it was a very unique, novel thing at the time. Granted, certainly, I mean, Christmas records are nothing new in the 1970s by any means. But for an artist like John Fahey, and sort of a more serious, compositional artist like John, to outside of the pop realm, it was sort of rare for artists of a serious nature to sort of very much take on that work, and play records like Greensleeves and whatnot. But John, he saw it, from a marketing standpoint, actually. And he's one of those guys where if it was someone else's idea, he wasn't interested. So, when producers came to him and said, "Hey, we want you to like do a record with Canned Heat as your backing band and make like a blues boogie record," he wouldn't want anything to do with that. But when he himself decided that Leo Kottke could make a great instrumental record, and that, doing a record of instrumental guitar versions of Christmas tunes would be successful, he had no problem, sort of enacting those ideas and enjoying them.
Hello there. John Fahey here. In this lesson, we'll be dealing with some of the arrangements of Christmas carols that I made. I got to put these glasses on. The lights are kind of hot in here. The first song is Old Lang Syne. Here's a few chords I use. If you bar at the 5th fret, you've got an F chord. And at the 7th fret, you've got a G chord. Or you can play it like that. And this chord down here, there seems to be some disagreement as to what exactly this chord is, and I'm not sure myself. So I think it's a partial F chord, but I use it as a relative minor.
It's interesting. Yeah, the Kottke record. If obviously many know the record and many know Kottke, but I don't. Maybe people don't know how successful it was. It essentially bankrolled Tacoma for the duration of the Tacoma's lifespan, and even getting sold into the Chrysalis label later on, and it allowed Fahey and Tacoma to experiment with all these different records. You could almost do another episode on all the interesting Tacoma records that came out in the '70s, whether it's the Bola Sette or Craig Leon. There's all kinds of interesting Tacoma records that came out probably because of Kottke's success. But the other thing I was hoping to get into are the orchestra records.
Oh yeah.
The Fahey, which ended up on Reprise, interestingly.
Yes. And I have to say, I love that record. I think I'd said this in part one. That was, I mean, my introduction to Fahey was, our friend Stevie and Nagalski. But when I got home after kind of being introduced to Fahey, one of the easiest records to get was that Rivers and Religions record. And I remember there was a chain store in the Maryland area called Record and Tape Traders. And it was a used CD, and I wore that CD out. The first 3 songs of Rivers and Religion, unreal, just like mind blowing to this day. And so that record holds a very special place in my heart. And the artwork on that is just I find it very striking because it's like it's
die cut.
Yeah, like it's just I'd never seen anything like that when I bought the record maybe a year later. I mean, I'd seen die cut stuff before, but it felt vintage without being a gimmick,
It's interesting that cover image is actually from a Disneyland ride. So it's interesting, sort of getting back to John's sort of creative impulses and whatnot. The orchestral records were very much his idea. That's what he wanted to do with a major label. So he got signed to Reprise sort of in the wake of Kottke's success. Label said, "Oh, we can monetize solo guitar. This stuff could really sell. There's an audience for this," and
Was it one of those things where like, oh, John Fahey, the name lives with Tacoma, but if we have a John Fahey and his orchestra, we can sign that as a project?
No, that wasn't it.
No? Okay.
They were sort of interested in John being sort of like the original Leo Kottke and sort of, following that trajectory. Like, well, if Leo Kottke is doing great, let's take the OG and, put him out there, records out to more people because there's an audience for it. Rather than sort of do something, in that vein, John was, convinced that, these orchestral records was what he wanted to do. He wanted to work with these musicians from the 1920s and 30s, some of whom are still around. These were like the original guys who played on the original records. So he put together like a really all-star cast. And again, these were obscure session musicians from, the 20s and 30s. But to John, they were, heroes because they played on some of his favorite 78s.
It's just interesting because this is not like no one else was doing something like this at the time. It was just Fahey's like, this is what I want to do. And and then they just went with it.
And he had the budget to do something like that.
Correct. But there wasn't an audience for what he was doing. And it actually alienated a lot of his fans because a lot of his fans saw him as being like this sort of contemporary, progressive, forward-thinking artists. And instead he's doing like all these like anachronistic, like old like Dixieland songs with these, old session musicians that, nobody really, that were not hip to anybody. This was not like hip, cool music. There wasn't an audience for it. There was no demand.
But that's like, that is his career. Like that is his career though, like in a nutshell almost. Well, like at least the beginnings of it. Cause if we're talking about not hip, like that was what he was sort of tracking down in like the 60s, the 50s, right? Like,
yeah, yes and no, because again, like he was drawing from country blues and bluegrass, and in the 60s that stuff had a revival. Guys like Skip James and Book of White were putting out new records. They were touring. There was a huge amount of interest in that kind of music. So John, at the time it wasn't that, uncool to be doing that sort of stuff. The Dixieland orchestral records were just like wildly uncool. Although there
Yeah.
was a move in the 70s that was like sort of historically looking back on some of that time in a, in a sort of nostalgic way. But in regards to record listening, and again, like I said, like there were times where John had great ideas that came from him that were, financially viable career decisions. Putting out the Cocky record, doing the Christmas records, like those were like conscious decisions that were very successful for John as a musician and as a record label owner. Doing these, orchestral records for a major label was, in a way, in my opinion, it was almost like self-sabotage. Not to say that he didn't truly enjoy what he was doing. He did. He got a huge kick out of playing and meeting these guys and playing this music. And like that was sincerely the music he wanted to make. And those were sincerely the records he wanted to make. That being said, there was just no real viable commercial pathway for records to be successful. So in some ways, he was sort of shooting himself in the foot in regards to commercial success. But on the other hand, he was insuring himself against disappointment. That way, if these records flopped, of course they flopped. They were almost intentionally designed to flop. Whereas opposed to like doing a record with like a bunch of guys from Canned Heat and stuff like that, there would be like, oh well, this could be a hit. You know what I mean?
I mean,
Like,
did Reprise just kind of say do whatever you want? I mean, was there? I mean, obviously, I know there's not going to be an A&R guy coming in there and being like, "What are you doing?" But like, was there some sort of, I don't know, like, did somebody from the label say, "Hey, maybe this isn't a good idea"?
I mean, I don't know. I'd have to ask Denny Bruce.
He's the producer on this one. Yeah.
Yeah, he was John's manager at the time. He was Kotke's manager. And he was sort of the middle person, I would imagine, between Fahey and the labels. That being said, I don't think anyone was really paying too much attention to what John was doing, one way or another. It seemed like the major labels in the 70s across the board were just, throwing everything at the wall and seeing what sticks. I think they had the money to do all this crazy stuff, across the industry. The record industry, the major labels were sort of at their peak in regards to revenue and whatnot. So, I don't think there was anyone really paying much attention. I don't think there was anybody that was really like too invested on John Fahey's success at the label end. And I think they were just like, well, if it works, it works. If it doesn't, tax write-off kind of thing.
There is one interesting name on here, Chris Darrow, who was in a version of the California Kaleidoscope. So there is a little bit of a psychedelic tie, and he had his own solo record on Fantasy and around that same time. So he adds a little bit of rock credibility, but he's still pretty obscure name. But otherwise, yeah, it's all kinds of session musicians, Nappy Lemaire,
Yep.
playing banjo. There's Calliope and piano, and it's not all. There's a couple of solo Fahey tracks on this, aren't there?
There's some beautiful solo instrumental Fahey tracks buried in those records that are as good or better, I think, than anything else in his catalog. And again, like we're saying, the 70s were such a peak of his prowess. And I think it goes to show that Gaster Soul and Jim O'Rourke and Tony Conrad in the 90s did that duo. They did a Fahey cover on that Gaster del Sol record from one of his 70s orchestral records, and it was one of his solo compositions from those records that they sort of revisited. And oh god, Dry Bones in the Valley is the track, and what an incredible track. Both the 70s version that Fahey did and the 90s version, the Tony Conrad and Jim O'Rourke duet of which both are just absolutely stellar.
too much more time on it, but now that time is sort of everything, right? Now that people look back on those records, do they have a better sort of reputation, you think, than they did even for the hardcore Fahey fans?
Some people have come around to really understanding Fahey's vision on those, and then there are other people that just, I remember, I was talking to Sam Charters. I asked him about those records, and he hated them. And he was like an ethnomusicologist who was very much into the music of the 20s and 30s and whatnot. And he thought they were just awful records.
I mean, they must have pressed a decent amount from a record collecting point of view. These are very easy to find. Anyone out there who wants some Fahey records for cheap, you can find these still pretty easy. And this is the third one too. Oh, this one's on Tacoma now.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, these are the ones I see the most. But to me,
Well,
they're interesting, and they give you a new perspective on Fahey. And by no means are they a disappointment.
but they're very sentimentally presented.
Sentimental is a good word for it. Yeah.
And it's very different from sort of the early Tacoma stuff. Again, like the early Tacoma stuff, there's more sort of, obviously during the Tom Weller psychedelic versions of those records, those records all sell for $100 plus, just because, a lot of which is just because the artwork is so striking and so great.
Mhm.
Collectors gravitate towards it. Whereas the major label stuff, after the ball, I mean, pick up that record cover again. That is
Yeah.
just not a cool record cover in any generation.
That is, yeah. Like if I didn't know that that was a Fahey record and I just saw that, that would be like one of those records that I would pack in when I'm sending records to just be like, this is to protect the
Yeah.
record I'm sending you.
It
You know what I mean? Like,
Also,
it looks
almost
like
Yeah.
a record you can't move from a dollar bin.
no.
right.
And it looks like it'd be a disco record, and this is like 4 years before
Just
disco.
nothing about that record that says like there's like cool stuff. And there's amazing material on that record. But I mean, it's just the artwork is just so horrible that, I'm sure it turned off a ton of, progressive music listeners.
Yeah.
So, like I said, sort of like across the board, like Fahey almost made these records to fail. Like, how could that record succeed?
Yeah.
Who's going to be buying that record? And why?
It's in 1973. I don't see it. So
And also, like, even Fahey fans wouldn't gravitate towards a record that looked like that or necessarily sounded like that. But they're fascinating records with incredible performances and compositions. And, again, the compositional stuff, if you really look at what Fahey was trying to do, they're massively successful records in regards to, achieving their aim musically. They're wonderful performances all around. There's a really great synchronicity between Fahey and the rest of the players on it, and just in general, they're pretty fascinating documents. And also, like as we sort of mentioned before, they're just some of the best solo Fahey performances are sort of nuzzled in these records, sort of unknown to many.
well, yeah, you have on Rivers and Religion, you have the funeral song for Mississippi John Hurt, which is a standout track for him. So yeah, just certainly don't ignore these records. If you see them out there, you should check them out. But talk about where he's heading then in the mid 70s, late 70s. Is obviously he's continues to release records like the Live in Tasmania.
Yep. Yeah.
Or I'm sorry, this is Visions Washington D.C.
Right, but yeah.
I have Tasmania somewhere else. But yeah, he's touring. He's just kind of. This is about when he's moving to the Oregon at this point. Or is that a little later?
Yeah, he moves to Oregon around the early '80s, and throughout the '70s, his career was sort of on autopilot for the most part. Like I said, there was a touring network both domestically and internationally. He had Tacoma that was still going, so he could release whatever he wanted to release whenever he wanted to release it. He had these major label deals, so he could do sort of more big budget stuff. So yeah, I mean, in a career-wise, he was somewhat comfortable and stable. And it wasn't really until the 80s that sort of, again, like, folk music, acoustic guitar stuff, counterculture, kind of outsider stuff really sort of drifted off the radar, and his career really started to stall out as there was less and less avenues for for his music.
I suppose. I mean, I guess that's the dawn of, or the new age thing starts to happen. You get the William Ackerman and all of that stuff. He flirts with that a little bit, does he not?
It's hard to say. I think all of those people came in his wake. So I think anything that sort of would be considered sort of like a forbearance for Windham Hill wasn't intentional. I don't think he ever did anything in reaction to Windham Hill. And I know he had a huge amount of resentment towards those players and towards New Age music.
Yes.
He absolutely abhorred it. And it's really understandable in a certain ways because John's music is so passionate. There's a lot of emotion, both positive and negative, and there's just so much feeling to his playing. And say what you want about Windham Hill is if you're it was more really about atmosphere than it was about emotional heft.
Yes.
So I think in some ways John really put his whole life on the line with his art, and I don't think that was the aesthetic and general practice of the artists on Windham Hill per se. Not to say that they weren't as serious or dedicated to their craft as John was. Certainly, George Winston was a huge bridge between John and that world. And William Ackerman himself was sort of his first record was The Navel of the Turtle, which was sort of a tribute to John. So I think basically the New Age movement took elements of Fahey's style, and I think in his opinion sort of anesthetized it, and that's how it became so popular because it was so easy. It's sort of like if you took Fahey and you took away all the ups and downs, the dynamicism of it and the intensity of it, you kind of get like more the Windham Hill kind of like vibes, kind of atmospheric kind of stuff, and which sold millions and millions and millions of copies, and certainly resonated with a huge audience. But John resented that very much. I think he saw the Windham Hill crew as minus George Winston because John discovered George Winston, so George was okay in his book. The same way that Cocky, John discovered Cocky, so Cocky was okay in his book because
Yeah.
John was sort of the big brother in both of those situations in a way. But for the rest of those artists, I think he had a lot of contempt for them. And he was very outspoken about his dislike and distaste for that scene.
Well, I was gonna say you have Robbie Basho, who did record a record for Windham Hill, which was a flop, but at this point has become one of his most collectible records. Um,
Yeah,
I guess he tried it intentionally or not to sort of, make something a little more crystalline, a little more sort of pretty, but we can talk about that record too. I love that record, but it does remind me like about the Basho Fahey kind of like rivalry, um, which was going on previous to all of that. But talk a little bit about that if you don't mind. Touch on, what their animosity was. And Basho, of course, recorded for Tacoma Records, but there was some sort of like competitive thing happening between them.
I would like to dedicate this music to Avatar Meher Baba, and I want to close with a Japanese sonata called Koweka Damur.
I think if you look at the history of music, in the 20th century, and you go about and you sort of like look at like certain artists and you say like, oh, how come this artist wasn't more successful? These records are so great and they're so much better than so much stuff that was so much more popular. How come this didn't take off? And invariably, I've found that generally speaking, there was a personality problem. And Robbie Basho and John Fahey were very much had huge personality deficits.
Mhm.
Robbie Basho came to the Tacoma School through Ed Denson, who was Fahey's label partner in Berkeley. So it wasn't really John that brought Robbie Basho into the fold. That was really an Ed Denson call. And to some, yes, they were on the same label. They played shows together. They had a lot of stylistic similarities. They're both largely solo instrumental guitarists for a long period of time. Although Basho very famously added vocals to some of his records later on. But so they were kind of seen, and there's just a lot of competition between these guys. Who's the best? You know what I mean? It's the same it is in any music scene.
Yeah.
And it's the same, whether it's like psychedelic rock guitar players or acoustic folk players or, any other genre. It's just like there's a lot of competition.
Do you think,
Everybody.
Steve, that was sort of, I don't want to say needed, but do you think that really helped Fahey in a certain way?
I mean, maybe it nudged him to get better as a player. I mean, obviously, during the 60s, he just got better and better and better, just, like exponentially. I mean, you go from like 64 to 67, between the second recording of the second album and third recording, and it's just like leaps and bounds in regards to musicianship. So I think it definitely helped Fahey sort of be on top of his game because there was competition. You had Kotke, you had Basho, you had a whole bunch of other players outside of that as well. But Fahey and Basho were not generally likable people. Again, John was, he had really strong opinions that he was not afraid to voice. And he insulted a ton of people. I mean, a lot of the Country Joe and the Fish guys didn't want anything to do with him. They found him to be like morose and just, toxic, in his alcohol abuse at the time. Robbie Basho, from all reports, was so convinced of his own greatness, he resented the fact that others didn't acknowledge him for being the sort of like, spiritual wizard that he considered himself. And so, he was described to me by people who knew him at the time as being insufferable. He also had a lot of problems with women. He was, always pursuing these women and failing because of his, remarkable sort of hubris and whatnot. So yeah, these guys were not like fun, cool dudes to be around.
Yeah.
Weren't like industry people. They didn't play the game. There's this really famous story that I talk about in the book where John had a headlining gig over Joni Mitchell.
That's a great story. Yeah.
When she was starting out, and Joni Mitchell's management, I think it was David Geffen and some other industry bigwigs, came up to John and asked if they could switch spots for this particular showcase, for scheduling reasons or something. I don't know what their motivation was, but John basically told them to go fuck themselves, and Joni Mitchell,
Yeah.
she's going to open up.
Yeah.
on the headliner.
Yeah, this is Joni Mitchell at the height of the height. Yeah, this is not. And David Geffen, right? I mean, this is John Fahey's like, that's almost like more ammo for him to be like, no, like I'm definitely not doing this.
Well, the career move would be to placate the industry insiders and see if you can negotiate like a tour slot with Joni or something like that. That's what a savvy sort of person would do in that situation, not tell the big shots to go fuck themselves over like the opening slot of a regular gig. But John had principles, and he stood by them 100%, and he didn't care at all about what these guys had to say or think or whatnot. Again, you're not you're not going to be that successful if you don't play the game, to a certain degree. And John had no interest in playing the game. Robbie Basho couldn't conceive how to play the game.
Yeah, it's like he was just in his own world in a sense.
And then you look at a guy like Leo Kotke, on the other hand, who to this day has a really solid career, and he is an affable, likable storyteller. Like his sets are like, or half of it is him like doing storytelling to the crowd. You know what I mean? And he's a really likable guy. You know what I mean? He's got this great kind of like narrative voice to him, and like again, like he's just like a really friendly, relatable, non-aggressive person, and he his career speaks to his personality, whereas Fahey and Basho spoke to theirs.
Right. And we should talk about, there's a great documentary on Robbie Basho that came out a few years ago. I think it's just The Voice of the Eagle, or Voice of the Eagle or Stallion. I always forget. But anyone who's a fan of Fahey or a fan of Basho absolutely should check that out. It definitely talks all about him.
They're really fascinating people, and I mean, John's attitude and sort of the changing tastes of listeners, by the 80s, it sort of really alienated him from the rest of the music world. Uh,
Hmm.
and at the time, he was really seen as like a guitar player, and which he also resented because he didn't necessarily want his success to be based off his technical abilities. He wanted his success to be based on his creativity and compositions. Whereas, other people were just looking for like, how do I play the fastest, finger picking pattern, or what's the secret to doing, this technique and whatnot. And just like his shows were attended by a lot of people who played guitar, and he hated talking about guitar. He hated the people coming up to him who were like asking for, musicianship advice, more or less like that. And like I said, his drinking just got worse and worse. And there's, you can find bootlegs on the internet of him just like astonishingly, drunk at his shows, and like heckling his own audience, and like getting into like weird philosophical debates with them, and just like it's just very bizarre kind of stuff. And Yeah, by the 80s, his career for, the most part had somewhat dried up. There weren't a lot of opportunities for him. People stopped calling. You know, and he was sort of in Salem, Oregon, which isn't really an music industry, hot spot. So he was sort of very alienated from the music industry up there, and he just sort of like retreated, into his you know mental health issues, his alcohol and pill addiction
Yeah.
issues, and just he just wasn't really functioning well, and his playing started to deteriorate.
Of course, back then I was smoking Salem's, I think. Now I live there.
By the end of
Right.
the 80s, he was just, you know, really wasn't as sharp as he used to be in regards to his playing. And you listen to a record like 87's, I Remembered Blind Joe Death. And it's definitely like
Hmm.
Fahey, and there's some really nice pieces on it, but I'd be hard pressed if you could find somebody who would, put it up
Yeah.
in top 10 Fahey records in his catalog.
These
Well,
are not
was
records.
Fahey
Yeah.
was Fahey kind of aware that this was sort of a major downturn for him, or was he operating as if this is just part of the mystique or the career?
It's hard to say. I think he was just so wrapped up in his own sort of internal world that I don't really know if he really saw his place in the greater scheme of the music industry and whatnot. I don't think he was really aware of what was going on. um, there's this great thing that Byron Coley told me when I was interviewing for the book. By the time we get to the 90s, Fahey has sort of become this like godfather of alternative culture, being, one of the first sort of like DIY independent labels, doing that sort of thing. And Byron Coley got this gig at Spin Magazine, and he got approved to do a feature on Fahey. So he flew up to Salem, Oregon, and he went over to Fahey's house and knocked, or motel, or where he was staying, or some flop house he was staying in, and knocked on the door. And Fahey's like, "Oh, I don't really want to talk." And Byron was like, well, I just plan to like drive around to record stores today if you want to come. And Fahey's like, oh, you want to go to record stores? Like, great. So they ended up going to like every record store in, the 100-mile radius or whatnot. But, at some point, Byron was playing John all these tapes of all this like, contemporary or, experimental music or whatnot. And, John was just like, blown away, and he's like, and he said one day, after, a couple weeks after that interview with Byron, he got a phone call from Byron where John was just furiously yelling at him about, why didn't you tell me about Throbbing Grizzle? Why didn't you tell me about industrial music?
Yeah, there's an interview in the documentary where I think Fahey, it's like, yeah, I guess this stuff, and I'm paraphrasing the quote, but it's like, I guess this already exists. It's called Death Industrial. Like the way he just
Yeah.
does it in such a like, oh,
Yeah, so it's sort of interesting. So, like, by the time he gets to, like alternative culture, underground music, new music, experimental, tape loop kind of, stuff, it already had like a couple decades of history to it, So, and he was just, and again, like, I think he was really liberated by this music because it wasn't about technique. He's like, oh, I can make records that are not about like how perfect my guitar playing is. I could just make these records about like soundscapes and moods, and I could, just you know do tabletop guitar stuff, or like, and he saw Sonic Youth and Jim O'Rourke and these players who, did like tabletop guitar or modified or prepared guitar stuff, and he was just like, wow, this is amazing. Like I'm free of
well,
all.
and it's funny you say that because it's almost like what you had just mentioned a couple of minutes ago, with just maybe part of it is the pressure of playing Fahey-esque. And then just to be able, like you're saying, to be like, oh, I don't have to be that way. It's almost like this very freeing kind of, I could still make important-esque records, but not be Fahey. Like that was,
Yeah, well, I don't have to be a guitar virtuoso. You know what I mean? Like Jim O'Rourke was not like, again, at the time we were doing a prepared tabletop stuff, and, Kevin Drum and these kind of guys. And that's who Fahey was like literally hanging out with. He was just like, whoa, like there's a whole other lane here that I didn't know anything about. And again, he wasn't really familiar with about the experimental music of the 70s and the 80s. Um,
But he
so
was fascinated that these people are name checking him as far as like, oh, Glenn Jones and Cul-de-sac. These guys know my entire career. Jim. It wasn't as if like they revered him already, and he was almost like buoyed by that and sort of like propped up, and that felt
very
good.
much so. And he saw himself really as the godfather of what they were doing,
Yeah.
not the godfather of what Wyndham Hill was doing or what, other guitar players were doing. And he was like, oh, this is really, he finally felt like he found his people in a large.
And to be clear, so he at this point has his renaissance, and he starts a label, Revenant Records.
Correct.
And he has almost a happy ending to his. This is sort of the dawn of his, or the final part of his career, and he would pass away a little later on. But he was in a very bad place in the 80s, but he slowly sort of got to a bit of a better place towards the end of his life.
Well, yes and no.
yeah.
Because
Not so much in living spaces, but
correct. Like he had debilitating health issues, debilitating like consumption issues where he would eat just like, like a tub of ice cream, just sitting there and just, like he was, ballooning out
I
of.
know we talked about it offline, but I finished the second time the Thurston Moore book, and one of the stories Thurston Moore has, there's a couple of different ones. They were on tour together, and Fahey was obsessed with, I think he said something like he was trying to say that Wendy's had the best burgers.
Yeah.
Like he was like obsessed with like making that claim. But there's an interesting story. It's like I think one of, if not the first time Thurston meets Fahey. Fahey is sitting at the edge of the stage. Thurston gets in there, I guess, sound checking is happening, and Fahey's messing with his guitar. And Thurston just kind of walks in there, and Fahey sees him and goes, "Oh, you're here. You fix it." And Thurston looks at him and he's like, "What are you talking about?" It's like, "Aren't you the guitar like tech or whatever?" And Thurston's like, "No, I'm opening up for you for the next 5 days." That starts their 5-day Trek tour, which kind of almost ends in, there's another story of they were walking down the street and Fahey, his belt buckle broke or he just didn't care. And Thurston's like, "We should buy you a belt to keep your pants up." Like, that's where Fahey physically and mentally was. It was very bizarre. It just, like, hearing Thurston like talk about that was just, it was heartbreaking, but also like, oh, that's the myth of Fahey.
Yeah, I mean, I think Glenn Jones, who had known Fahey, for many decades, and obviously collaborated with him with Cul-de-sac in the '90s on a record. He had known John much longer than the rest of his contemporaries, and guys like Thurston and Jim O'Rourke. So he already had like this long existing relationship with John. And Glenn, said that John, a lot of his eccentricities were like playing to the younger audience. He thought he was trying to be like this weird, crazy, insane, iconoclastic, outsider musician that he thought they wanted him to be. So yeah, so according to Glenn, he really leaned in, to his erraticism when he was dealing with people like No Neck Blues Band and Thurston and Jim and the sort of the younger people in his field. And it's weird. So he made, a slew of experimental records. He made Womb Life with Jim O'Rourke, and some of his later records. And they're sort of controversial. Some people really like them. Some people really dislike them. And my personal opinion is I think the records are better than their detractors accuse them of being. But I also don't think they're as brilliant as their supporters proclaim them to be either. As well as that sort of things like that.
Yeah.
And again, these people might exist, but I know a lot of people in the experimental noise world and whatnot, and I can't say that I've ever met somebody who's like super into Nurse with Wound and loves the late Fahey records, but isn't interested in the guitar records. I think Fahey's later records are of greatest interest to Fahey fans. The reason why is because I think they reveal more about his psychological state of mind and sort of like where this artist is in the world at this time in his career than it is about the sounds he's producing, per se.
Some interesting ideas. I mean, the Mill Pond double 7-inch has some extreme noise on it. There's definitely some experiments. Like feels like he's got license to try some daring things. But yeah, I think I agree. I mean, it's essentially an interesting part of his career, but it's not as if it's like, oh, everything else he did before this was not for me, but this stuff is the gold.
I guess I sort of land.
Or is that you, Sean?
I don't revere these records any higher than other parts of his career, but I think for me there is, and again I think it goes by what you both are saying, especially you, Steve, where it's like it reveals that there is a lineage there that we can trace from where he starts to where he sort of finishes. And what's really interesting too, it feels somewhat of a victory lap, because you had intimated earlier that he finally sort of found his people. And whether you like these records or not, he seems very comfortable in these records. Like,
yeah,
he seems to live in that space.
He wasn't really playing for a crowd. He was playing for himself finally. The acoustic records, to some degree, he was playing for an audience. and that's sort of like the magic in some of the early Tacoma records, because it was sort of like a mix between that, where he was like, he's composing and splicing these records like to himself at home, you know what I mean? And then once it sort of became an audience, you got an immense amount of pressure to, to please them, and, and exist within their world. And again, by the time we get to the 90s and he's making experimental records, he's not playing for anyone but himself. And you're right. I think he is really, really pleased, doing that. That being said, a lot of times he was living out of his car, flop house motels.
Yeah.
And
There's another Thurston story, I think. Maybe it's Byron, but I think this Thurston knocked on his hotel door and Fahey opens up the door and he's just like totally nude or something, like, or like mostly nude, and it's just quarters that are just falling off of his like back. And it's like Thurston was like, or maybe it's Byron, but maybe I'm confusing the story a bit. But anyways, the idea is that they open the door and they see Fahey and he's just so disheveled, but it's Fahey, and that was still, it's like it's Fahey, and that was
it's
kind of the myth of it.
it's weird though, because in some ways, my opinion is like, he sort of like infantilized himself and made other people take care of him. You know what I mean? Like in some ways, he was almost like a giant spoiled baby.
Right.
And people like, Jim and Thurston were like, in such reverence of John that they would literally like run around and do insane stuff to try to make things work for him. And the more other people tried to make things work for him, the more, monkey wrenches he'd throw at them. The more people would like set up tour shows from him, the more he'd just not show up to the airport. The more, you know what I mean? Like just like stuff like that. So
It reminds me of the that band Pentagram and the singer for Pentagram.
yeah,
Same sort of thing where that dude is totally revered in like doom metal circles, and the people around him, especially the younger people, end up doing everything they can to make it work, and he is so self-destructive that it doesn't even matter, and
oh, very much so. I mean, there's this, Jim O'Rourke told me the story where he gets to some show, he didn't want to play the show. So he fakes having a heart attack. Everybody freaks out. Jim is like carrying up a flight of stairs to get him to like an ambulance, thinking he's like passed out. And like Jim stops for a second. John just like, keep going. You just wanted to get out, like again, like, so, I think he was testing people's patience and the limits to what they would do for him. And at the same time, the people who really loved him and cared about him, he would push away. His wife Melody, he pushed away. After they broke up, he had a girlfriend for a while in Salem who really cared about him, Melissa Stevenson, and she would have let him stay with her forever. But, he chose to go live in homeless shelters or sleep in the back of his car or something like that. And he turned down, the big major label record in the 90s, that he could have gotten a payday for. And he chose to sort of live a very sad and poor lifestyle until eventually it killed him. I mean, he was 66 when he died, and he looked like he was 100 almost. I mean, he didn't, he looked older than he was, and he was a really heavy guy. I mean, he was already a tall guy, like he's like 6'5". He was a very, he had a really big frame, and he just saddled with a ton of extra weight from, poor diet, no exercise.
what was his finances like? Because I know around towards the tail end, and we vaguely mentioned this earlier on, but he told me like this album is essentially about a woman that he was obsessed with,
Yes.
to the point where he goes to Japan and demands her hand in marriage, and her family's like, what the F is going on?
I think they met him at the airport with the police and was like, go away. Yeah, no,
Wow.
he became obsessed with these people. And he'd meet these like, and again, he was in his 60s. He'd meet these young women in the avant-garde community, in they're at shows, and just like have a 5-minute conversation with them and like totally fall madly in love with them and love bomb them and send them packages with literally like 24-hour mixtapes of like music and crazy love letters that just go on, of people he met for 5 minutes.
Wow.
And he was just absolutely overwhelming. And I think his, again, the language wasn't really there at the time, but I think now he would almost be considered like a toxic love bombing, misogynist, and I don't think his behavior would be, at the time, it was considered erratic and eccentric. Like, oh, look at this like crazy old weird outsider, X60s crazy dude. Now, I mean, it would absolutely not be acceptable in the
I know
parameters.
that we're running out of a little bit of time, but I just really wanted to quickly touch on. I know the Charlie Patton box, that's obviously
you, yeah.
revered.
Yes.
But I wanted to quickly touch on the importance of Albert Ayler to Fahey and why Fahey felt he had to do the work for Ayler. Like, well, what kind of started that box? And if you could just kind of quickly.
And the label as well, Revenant
Yeah,
too.
yeah.
So, Revenant is sort of a continuation of Tacoma in a lot of ways. And it was a way for John to interact with the contemporary music scene, as well as, reissue a lot of recordings that were really influential to him, that never been on CD, stuff like Doc Boggs, the fourth installment of the Anthology of American Folk Music. And then, stuff that was more contemporary, like Derek Bailey and Jim O'Rourke and things like that. And he met up with this guy, Dean Blackwood, who was a fan of Fahey's, and he was an attorney and a supporter, and he just wanted to help Fahey sort of like get back on solid footing. So he sort of did the nuts and bolts of Revenant. And the Charlie Patton box, that was something that Fahey was unbelievably passionate about. Charlie Patton was one of the fundamental artists, of Fahey's career, and just one of the biggest influences on him. And Revenant, to its credit, really made these like incredible box sets of unbelievable detail and quality. Both, really bringing together all the historical artifacts, not only the audio, but visual, text, and really put it together in a package that was spectacular. And so yeah, no, he really succeeded in Revenant in creating these really beautiful, lasting documents, both of contemporary music and important historical documents. In regards to Albert Ayler, I never came across any reference to Ayler directly from Fahey. I don't know if the Ayler box was really more of a Dean Blackwell production than a John Fahey one. Again, I'm not sure, but there's nothing I've ever come across in my research that had John mention Ayler. And I would have definitely made note of it, because I'm a huge Ayler fan, and certainly find him fascinating. But I don't even know particularly if John was really aware of that kind of free jazz in that regard.
Right. Didn't even like Albert Ayler. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't even know if he had any, knowledge of Ayler's career.
The only other thing I really wanted to quickly touch on, because I think, now that we're at the end of sort of Fahey's career, Fahey has passed away. One of his, to me, a major disciple of him is Jack Rose.
Sure.
Like, Jack Rose is, to me, one of the most important guitarists post Fahey in that world. I just wanted to, if you could quickly sort of touch on Jack Rose a little bit and his almost carrying the torch. There were certain things that Jack Rose was doing aesthetically, obviously musically, but even the story of Jack Rose pressing a 78 and putting it in thrift stores. If you could just touch on that.
Jack Rose was an artist who was tremendously influenced by John Fahey. I say Glenn Jones and Jack Rose, in my opinion, are probably the two most authentic disciples of Fahey's style musically. If you're really like pointing out to people, not that they, play like John, but I think they took elements of his style and really like brought it to new places and to new audiences and whatnot. And Jack was definitely the most prolific and probably the most dynamic player of Fahey's style in the early 2000s. That was, I think Jack really, really carried the torch for John, and was a scholar of John and his work, very much so. So Jack took a lot from John, stylistically and performance wise. And I think Jack was a little bit of a more technical player than John. So I think his work, it's sort of like in Fahey's style, but like delivered with like a little bit more punch and aggression in this really dynamic way. So yeah, Jack. It's sad when I started working on my book, Jack was on my short list of people to talk to. And I sort of put him closer to the end of the list just because, he was a young guy in his 30s, and I figured let me start with the old heads first.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, by the time I got to the 90s, Jack had passed away of a heart attack. I think he was 36 or 37.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I
not even 40.
I had booked I did a festival back in the mid 2000s or early 2010s, and the last time I did it, one of my main dreams was to book Jack Rose, and I ended up. It was funny because Piss Jeans were gonna play, and then immediately Jack Rose was gonna play right after Piss Jeans. I thought that dynamic was really interesting because the year prior, another somewhat of a disciple, not entirely, but early Kurt Vile, I think, is sort of a somewhat of a disciple of Fahey in certain ways. But anyways, I booked Jack Rose, and I communicated with him through email. I said it was an honor. He was about to put out, I think, the first Thrill Jockey record. And I got a message the day that he passed away from his manager, and it was intense. It was, and I knew he was so young, and it was, but like you had said, it felt like he was really carrying the torch. He really did put a little more oomph into it. I think maybe that's part of the pelt kind of thing,
Yeah.
So I mean, it's just when I think of Fahey and all of the disciples, Rose is one of the just towering figures. And if for those watching, if you're wondering where to go next after Fahey in terms of maybe more modern, and again, Jack passed away, I think 15 years ago. It'll be this year. And so it's not really modern anymore, but yeah, Rose is a heavy figure, for sure.
I'd just like to take this opportunity to sort of piggyback on what you're just saying, Sean, and say for those of you who are interested in the music of John Fahey and Robbie Basho and fingerstyle guitar playing and contemporary solo guitar playing as well, I think you could find wonderful examples of various contemporary styles on the VDSQ guitar label, which is run by myself, Steve Lowenthal.
Mm-hmm.
We have about 34 full-length LPs of instrumental guitar music, and I would very much say that fans of John Fahey could certainly find a lot they could be excited about. I
don't have any in front of me here, but I've got a bunch. I recently got the was it Wendy Eisenberg? You did a Wendy Eisenberg. Yeah. I recently got that.
For fans of fingerpicking, the latest release on VDSQ is by a young artist named Barry Archie Johnson. He's out here in LA, and it is an absolutely stunningly beautiful melodic fingerpicking record, the likes of which hasn't been made in many, many years. There are certain new age influences on it. Barry does flute overdubs on a couple songs, and LA saxophone hero Patrick Shiroshi guests on a track. And it's just one of my favorite contemporary guitar records I've heard, and it's just beautiful, beautiful, beautiful playing. In my opinion, it's probably like the most beautiful record that's ever been put out on VDSQ. So
I'll be checking that out. Thank you for mentioning your label, and we'll link to your label because
please do. But yeah, Barry Archie Johnson, Fortune's Mirror, out on VDSQ on LP now. Great record. And there's a whole host of other artists on VDSQ that really,
Well,
you
to
know,
me, even legendary artists now like Bill Orchid, like
yeah.
like that. I mean, if we're talking about the more out there, like to me, Bill Orchid now is like Fahey just deconstructed to its absolute.
Yeah.
I think Fahey would love Bill. I think they would get along
Yeah.
famously. I think John would really appreciate Bill's sense of humor, and just sort of his whole, unique take on guitar in general. But Bill's a pretty sardonic guy, and so is John, and I think they would have definitely had had a lot to, I think they'd enjoy having a drink together.
Just gonna say again, if you want to hear, or well, obviously, if you want to read, I should say, a lot more stories, tales of Fahey. There's a ton more stuff in the book that we didn't even get into. Fascinating read, and what a character. This book's out there. Dance of Death. Thank you, Steve, for being here. Thank you, Sean.
Steve. It's an honor. Again,
Yeah,
we really appreciate your time and the work that you put into that book. It shows, and I could tell the passion you still have for Fahey even years after that book has been published.
yes.
And it's just been an absolute pleasure to talk with you for like 2 hours about Fahey, and I really appreciate it. It's an honor.
Oh, thank you guys both so much for asking. The last thing I'm just gonna say for this, yeah, I've always felt that Fahey's sort of been with me in an odd way. I'm not a superstitious person. I'm not, particularly spiritual or anything like that. But I've always sort of felt like Fahey was sort of like my spirit guide. When I hear a voice that says, go right, and I listen to it, I always kind of feel like that's Fahey, sort of, you know, watching over me because he's a timeless figure, and his music will last forever, and being part of his story in the smallest way is to me the most important work I've done in my life, and I'm really proud of it, and I thank you guys so much for acknowledging the work and for having me here to talk about it.
Great. Well, thank you. And yeah, hope everyone enjoys this, and check out the book, check out VDSQ, and take care.
Thanks, everybody.